Welcome back, everybody. It's Dr. Setka. This week, we're turning our attention to the literature of abolition. It's very important to understand the abolitionist movement in Britain in its historical context, and to also understand how it relates to the Romantic period. So first and foremost, we want to remember that the Romantic thinker privileges the individual. And in so doing, we start to see this development of what we might call a greater sense of human empathy for the suffering of enslaved peoples. This is largely in reaction to weak Enlightenment attempts to justify the enslavement of Africans on a so-called rational or scientific basis. Late 18th century Britons, so Britons living in the late 1700s, prided themselves on how their constitution safeguarded individual liberty. However, their economy depended increasingly on wealth obtained through the enslavement of others. Members of Parliament and even the missionary arm of the Anglican Church, which is the national church of England, numbered among the absentee owners of Caribbean plantations that exploited the labor of enslaved Africans. The maritime industries of large prosperous cities like Bristol and Liverpool were heavily involved in procuring this labor supply. Beginning in the 17th century, so the 1600s, a triangular trade had been established, which saw ships sail to the west coast of Africa to buy or kidnap human cargo, voyage across the Atlantic to the New World, where those slaves would be sold at a tremendous premium, and then, in the third leg of the triangle, return to Britain carrying the colonial goods that fed Europeans' growing appetites for things like tobacco, rum, and sugar. By the 1700s, more than 40,000 Africans annually were being packed into British slave ships. The mortality rate for these people during the horrific Middle Passage has been estimated at 1 in 6. 1/3 died within 3 years of disembarking in the West Indies, often from tropical diseases or the mistreatment and sexual abuse meted out to them on the plantations. Through the first 3/4 of the 18th century, those few British people who had considered these evils at all had, for the most part, rationalized them away. And you'll see this reflected in the work of former British citizens like Thomas Jefferson and his notes on the state of Virginia, where he devotes an entire passage to providing, quote unquote, scientific rationalization of slavery. For many, slavery seemed to be simply the cost of doing business in the New World, and the West Indian planters' rights to secure possession of their property, even property that constituted people or was constituted by human beings, appeared beyond challenge. The link between slave labor and the consumer pleasures that defined their daily lives escaped most Britons' notice. How little think the giddy and the gay, while sipping o'er the sweets of charming tea, how oft their luxury robs the wretch of rest, lamented Mary Burkett in her 1789 poem on the slave trade. Whereas across the Atlantic, the white settlers of the southern United States and the white elites of the Sugar Islands were outnumbered and continually anxious, with reason, that the enslaved might revolt and avenge their wrongs, white Britons, by contrast, contrived to enjoy the fruits of slavery without really thinking about its costs. The movement for abolishing the slave trade that was launched in the 1780s challenged that willful ignorance. The abolitionists mobilized the power that the stories and poems they distributed had to break down the boundaries between out there and in here. They brought distant suffering and violence home. Almost every major poet working in the late 18th century wrote for this cause. As an aside, for pro-slavery writers, prose was overwhelmingly the medium of choice, right? So they're not turning to poetry, they're writing essays. So in amassing the so-called dossier of national crime, abolitionist literature changed how the public thought about collective moral responsibility. It also evidenced the power that might accrue to those who harnessed the emergent force of mass literacy. Again, as you'll remember in our initial lecture on Romanticism, more people are gaining the ability to read. And so art is one way to influence the growth of this political movement. At its launch in 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Trade in Slaves, that's a mouthful, I think they needed a PR campaign to change the name. Anyway, this society really only included a handful of members. Nevertheless, abolitionism soon became a popular movement. That same year, 1787, 2/3 of the adult male population of Manchester, a big city in the north of England, signed petitions calling on Parliament to investigate the slave trade. Later, 300,000 families pledged to boycott Caribbean sugar, which was produced via slave labor. Though marginalized by later historians, members of Britain's Black community, an impoverished group who at this time numbered about 10,000 to 15,000, also found public voices in the struggle for abolition. There were Black writers such as Olaudah Equiano, who is pictured here, and Ottobah Cugoano, and before them figures such as James Somerset, the enslaved man who had the audacity to test white men's law and so force the judiciary to declare outright in the Mansfield Judgment of 1772 that, in fact, there was no legal basis for slavery on English ground. So I want to be very careful to center and uplift these Black voices because the tendency in white historiography has been to marginalize them, and it's very important that we recognize the centrality of their contribution to this effort. That said, it was difficult for these activists to parlay public opinion into legislative action. William Wilberforce, the Society's chief representative in Parliament, was consistently outmaneuvered by pro-slavery politicians, who variously dismissed the witnesses he introduced, cited biblical precedents legitimizing modern slavery, or insisted that, thanks to their owners' benevolent care, West Indian slaves were better off than British laborers. His motions for abolition were repeatedly voted down or allowed to die in committee, defeats bitterly memorialized in Anna Letitia Barbauld's 1791 poem, Epistle to William Wilberforce. The radical turn that revolutionary activity in France took in the 1790s proved to be another setback. Pro-slavery agitators seized the opportunity to portray abolition as dangerous to social stability. The petitioning among white British subjects that had occurred in the early stages of the abolitionist campaign looked different in this altered context. A menacing attempt on the part of the governed to overthrow their rightful rulers. Then you add to this mix the revolution in the French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, which was later Haiti, led by former slaves Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture, occasioned an increase in racist rhetoric. The carnage of what became known as the Haitian Revolution was kind of decried as the inevitable consequence of recklessly introducing primitive minds to modern politics schemes of perfection, right? So this is essentially resulting in a smear campaign. Nonetheless, subsequent events made apparent the penalties that Britain would pay for continued support of colonial slavery. The few British soldiers who returned from their tours of duty in the West Indies during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars returned with news of just how resolute an enemy enslaved people seeking their freedom could be. Napoleon's reintroduction of slavery into the French Empire in 1802 enabled supporters of abolition to counter the idea that disrupting this element of British industry would aid Britain's commercial rivals. Instead, they could link support for their cause to the war effort, right? So it becomes patriotic to support the abolitionist cause. So in 1807, Parliament at last voted for abolition. Unfortunately, it took 26 years before slavery was fully abolished in the British Empire. Another wave of political agitation in England, spearheaded by a new anti-slavery society, bloody rebellions in Barbados in 1816, Guyana in 1823, and Jamaica in 1831, and finally a reform of Parliament that reduced the number of votes controlled by the West Indian interests before the Emancipation Bill was enacted. The strategies for depicting violence, suffering, and retaliation that anti- and pro-slavery writers developed over the course of this long debate altered the cultural landscape. The influence of their writings is discernible throughout Romantic literature. In Romantic authors' apocalyptic imaginings, exploration of themes of guilt and confession, interest in the workings of pity, and consciousness of how language can fail in the face of atrocity. This week's readings, which document the early phase of the abolitionist movement, suggest the variety of moves writers made to galvanize the attention of the reading public. I hope you find great value and meaning in our work this week. See you next time.